Picture this: Christmas morning, surrounded by family, the tree sparkling with lights, presents scattered everywhere, and your mother looks you dead in the eye and tells you the world would be more peaceful if you just vanished. 3 months later, she's sobbing on my doorstep because the bank is foreclosing on the house I'd been secretly paying for since I was 23. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how one cruel Christmas comment cost my family everything they thought they were entitled to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins in a white colonial house on Maple Street in Riverside, Ohio, where the American dream was supposed to live, but had somehow gotten lost in the shuffle of broken promises and unpaid bills. The house had 4 bedrooms, 2 and a half baths, a 2-car garage, and a mortgage that nobody in my family seemed capable of acknowledging existed except for me. I'm Rachel Johnson, 26 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've been living a double life. By day, I worked as a marketing coordinator at Henderson Associates, a mid-sized firm downtown that specialized in helping small businesses find their voice. By night and every weekend, I ran a freelance graphic design business from my childhood bedroom, taking on projects that ranged from wedding invitations to complete brand overhauls for startup companies. Most people my age were figuring out their career paths or traveling or dating or doing whatever 20-somethings are supposed to do with their newfound freedom. Me? I was busy making sure my family didn't lose their home. See, 3 years ago, when I was fresh out of college with my marketing degree and ready to conquer the world, life had other plans. My father, David Johnson, had worked at Riverside Manufacturing for 15 years, operating heavy machinery and bringing home a steady paycheck that covered our mortgage, utilities, and gave us a comfortable middle-class existence. He was the kind of man who prided himself on providing for his family, who wore his work boots like a badge of honor, and who always said that as long as he had 2 hands and a strong back, we'd never want for anything. Then the plant closed, not downsized. Not restructured, closed, permanently. The owners had found cheaper labor overseas, and in one devastating afternoon, my father and 300 other workers were handed pink slips and told their services were no longer needed. Just like that, our primary source of income evaporated, leaving behind a family of 5 with no backup plan and bills that didn't care about economic hardship. The thing about financial crisis is that it doesn't announce itself with dramatic music and warning signs. It creeps in slowly, quietly, like water seeping through a crack in the foundation. At first, we thought Dad would find another job quickly. He was experienced, reliable, had great references. The unemployment benefits would carry us through the transition period, and soon enough, everything would return to normal. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into a year. Then 2 years. Then 3. During this time, my younger sister Emma graduated with an art degree from Ohio State and moved back home to figure out her next steps. Those steps apparently involved sleeping until noon, spending her days creating abstract paintings that she insisted were going to make her famous someday, and contributing exactly $0 to household expenses. She did, however, contribute plenty of opinions about how our meals could be more organic, how our Wi-Fi was too slow for her online portfolio work, and how the house would look better if we invested in some new furniture. My younger brother Tyler took a different approach to post-graduation life. Rather than pretending to pursue a career, he simply decided that college wasn't for him after completing 2 years and accumulating enough student debt to buy a decent car. He moved back into his childhood bedroom and committed himself full-time to what he called finding his passion. This apparently required extensive research via video games, Netflix series, and long philosophical discussions with his equally unmotivated friends about the meaninglessness of traditional work structures. Meanwhile, my mother, Patricia Johnson, had never worked outside the home. She'd married my father straight out of high school had 3 kids by the time she was 25, and built her identity around being a wife and mother. She was good at it too. Our house was always clean, meals were always homemade, and she volunteered at our schools and churches throughout our childhood. But when the financial crisis hit, instead of seeing it as an opportunity to enter the workforce, she seemed to view it as a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself without her involvement. So there I was, 23 years old with a brand new job that paid $38,000 a year, watching my family sink deeper into debt, while everyone except me seemed to believe that some magical solution would present itself. The unemployment benefits covered maybe half of our monthly expenses. Our savings, what little we'd had, disappeared within the first 6 months. Credit cards got maxed out. Late notices started arriving in increasingly urgent colors of paper. I remember the exact moment I realized I had to step up. It was a Tuesday evening in November, about 8 months after Dad lost his job. I came home from work to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills with tears streaming down her face. The foreclosure notice was right on top, printed on official-looking letterhead that made everything feel terrifyingly real. 60 days, she whispered when she saw me. They're giving us 60 days before they start the process. Dad was in his recliner in the living room, remote in hand, staring at the television without really watching anything. The defeat in his posture was heartbreaking. This man who had worked so hard to provide for us, who had taught me the value of persistence and responsibility, looked completely lost. That night, I made a decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I calculated our monthly expenses, figured out what we absolutely needed to survive, and committed to covering whatever gap my family couldn't fill. It was supposed to be temporary, just until Dad found work, just until we got back on our feet. I started with the mortgage payment, $1,847 a month. It was more than half my take-home pay, but I figured I could manage it for a few months. I opened a new checking account and set up automatic payments so my parents wouldn't have to worry about the timing or the stress of writing that check every month. I told them I was helping out with some of the bills, but I never specified exactly how much I was contributing. They seemed relieved to not have to think about it. But $1,800 was just the beginning. The electric bill averaged $230 monthly, especially during Ohio winters when the heating costs soared. Water and sewer added another $110. Gas for heating was seasonal, but could spike to $300 during the coldest months. Car insurance for 3 vehicles ran $240. Health insurance, thankfully, I could stay on my parents' plan for a few more years, but that cost them $450 monthly. Internet and cable, which Tyler insisted was essential for his job searching and Emma needed for her art portfolio, added another $160. Then there were the variable expenses that somehow became my responsibility by default. Groceries for 5 people averaged around $600 monthly, especially since Emma had developed expensive tastes during college, and Tyler could eat an entire week's worth of food in 2 days. Household supplies, clothing, car maintenance, the occasional dinner out, birthday gifts, Christmas presents. It all added up to a number that made my stomach clench every time I calculated it. Within 6 months of Dad losing his job, I was covering approximately $3,000 in monthly family expenses. My entire paycheck plus every dollar I could earn from freelance work went directly into keeping our family afloat. I lived like a college student on a poverty budget while supporting 4 adults who seemed to have forgotten that money was a finite resource. The freelance work became essential. After 8 hours at my day job, I'd come home and spend another 4 to 6 hours designing logos, creating website graphics, working on marketing materials for small businesses. Weekends were entirely devoted to client projects. I gave up social activities, dating, hobbies, travel, anything that cost money or time I couldn't spare. My college friends slowly stopped inviting me places because I always had to decline due to work or budget constraints. My bedroom became my office, my sanctuary, and my prison all at once. I had 2 monitors set up on a desk pushed against the window, graphic design software running constantly, client files organized in carefully labeled folders. The walls were covered with project timelines, payment schedules, and inspirational quotes about persistence and success that I'd printed out during particularly difficult weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was designing marketing materials to help other businesses succeed, I was slowly disappearing into a life that revolved entirely around everyone else's needs and comfort. But here's the thing about becoming the family's financial backbone when you're barely out of college. Nobody acknowledges it as anything special. It just becomes the new normal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My parents stopped stressing about bills because they knew I'd handle them. Emma and Tyler stopped worrying about contributing because they knew I'd cover whatever they couldn't. The pressure that should have been shared among 5 adults fell entirely on my shoulders. And somehow, that just became how things were. I told myself it was temporary. Dad would find work. Emma would get a job in her field. Tyler would figure out his direction. We'd return to a normal family dynamic where everyone contributed according to their ability. I just needed to hold things together until that happened. Months passed, then a year, then 2 years. Dad did look for work, especially in the beginning. He filled out applications, went to interviews, followed up on leads. But after 15 years at the same company, his skills felt outdated in a job market that wanted college degrees and computer proficiency for positions that used to require only experience and a strong work ethic. Rejection after rejection wore him down until he started spending more time watching daytime television than searching employment websites. Emma got a part-time job at a coffee shop, declaring that she needed to stay in the arts rather than selling out to corporate work. She contributed maybe $200 monthly to household expenses, while spending considerably more than that on art supplies, trendy clothes, and social activities with friends who had real jobs and disposable income. Tyler briefly worked at a few different places: a movie theater, a restaurant, a retail store, but always found reasons to quit within a few months. The hours were wrong. The managers were idiots. The work was beneath his intellectual capacity. He'd spend weeks, after each job loss, talking about his plans to start his own business or go back to school. But those conversations never translated into action. Meanwhile, I was thriving professionally even as I was drowning personally. My freelance business grew through word-of-mouth referrals. Clients loved working with someone who was reliable, creative, and always available, because I literally had no other life commitments. My day job performance earned me 2 promotions and salary increases that went directly into the family expense fund. By the 3rd year, I was making close to $60,000 annually between my job and freelance work. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having at my age, and I was living like I made minimum wage because every extra dollar went toward maintaining my family's lifestyle. The psychological toll was something I didn't fully understand until much later. I developed an anxiety disorder that manifested as constant worry about money, even when our bills were current and my accounts were stable. I had trouble sleeping because I'd lie awake calculating expenses and projecting future costs. I stopped making plans for my own future because I couldn't see past the immediate need to keep everything from falling apart. Most insidiously, I began to define my worth entirely through my usefulness to others. My family needed me, and that felt important, even when it meant sacrificing everything I wanted for my own life. I convinced myself that this was what love looked like, putting others' needs before my own, ensuring their comfort even at the cost of my own dreams and goals. The worst part was how invisible my sacrifice had become. Because I handled everything so efficiently, because I never complained or asked for gratitude, because I made their financial dependence on me as seamless as possible, my family simply forgot that our stability was entirely dependent on my income. They started talking about our house, our car payments, our grocery budget, as if everyone was contributing equally. When Emma wanted to redecorate the living room, she'd show me Pinterest boards and expect me to figure out how to afford her vision. When Tyler needed car repairs, he'd hand me the estimate and assume I'd take care of it. When my parents wanted to host family gatherings, they'd plan elaborate meals and decorations without considering who would pay for them. I enabled this dynamic because I thought I was being loving and responsible. I thought I was temporary helping my family through a difficult period. I thought eventually they'd recognize what I'd done and appreciate the sacrifice I'd made to keep us all together. I was wrong about all of it. Christmas was approaching, and like every year since Dad lost his job, the financial pressure intensified. There were gifts to buy, a big dinner to plan, decorations to purchase, and family coming to visit who would expect the same level of hospitality we'd always provided. My mother started making lists and plans, excited about hosting her sisters, family from Columbus, and creating the perfect holiday memories. She handed me a budget she'd created for Christmas expenses: $800 for gifts, $300 for decorations, $500 for food and drinks, $200 for miscellaneous holiday costs. $1,800 total to be handled by me naturally, though she presented it as our Christmas budget, as if everyone would be contributing equally. I looked at that list and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. For 3 years, I'd been funding my family's entire existence while they treated me like a helpful roommate who happened to be good with money. I'd given up my 20s, my independence, my own dreams, to ensure that their lives remained comfortable and unchanged despite our financial crisis. And they'd never once said thank you. Never acknowledged the weight I was carrying. Never recognized that without my income, they'd have lost everything years ago. Christmas morning was going to change all of that, though I didn't know it yet. I thought I was just going to get through another expensive holiday season and continue, carrying my family until some undefined future moment when they'd finally become self-sufficient. I had no idea that my mother was about to give me the gift of clarity wrapped in the cruelest words she'd ever spoken to me. December in Ohio carries a particular kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel more difficult. The gray skies seem to press down on you, and the bare trees create a landscape that matches the emptiness I was beginning to feel in my chest. Christmas was 3 weeks away, and my mother had already begun her annual transformation into what she called her holiday hostess mode. This year was going to be special, she announced over breakfast one Tuesday morning. We were hosting not just our immediate family, but Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda from Columbus, along with their twin daughters who were now in high school. It would be the first time in 2 years that the extended family gathered at our house, and Mom was determined to make it perfect. I watched her flip through magazine pages she'd torn out, showing me elaborate table settings and dessert displays that looked like they belonged in a fancy restaurant, rather than our modest dining room. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she described her vision for Christmas Eve dinner, Christmas morning breakfast, and the casual gathering she wanted to host on Christmas afternoon. The reality of what she was planning began to sink in as she continued talking. She wanted to completely redecorate the living room with a new color scheme. The old Christmas decorations weren't sophisticated enough anymore. She'd seen some beautiful gold and burgundy themes on Pinterest that would photograph better for social media. The menu she'd planned included dishes that required ingredients we'd never bought before, specialty items from the expensive grocery store across town. Emma was enthusiastic about Mom's plans, offering to help with the aesthetic elements and suggesting we hire someone to professionally photograph the family gathering. Tyler thought it sounded like a great idea and volunteered to handle the music playlist, which apparently required upgrading our sound system. Dad nodded along agreeably, mentioning that it would be nice to show Mark and Linda how well we were doing despite the employment situation. Nobody mentioned who was going to pay for any of this. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing my coffee, and calculating numbers in my head while my family planned what was shaping up to be the most expensive Christmas we'd ever attempted. New decorations could easily cost $400 if Mom went with her Pinterest inspiration. The menu she was describing would require at least $600 in specialty groceries. If we upgraded the sound system like Tyler suggested, that was another $300. Professional photography would probably run $250. But the bigger issue wasn't just the Christmas expenses. It was the attitude underlying the entire conversation. My family was planning to spend money we didn't have to impress relatives who had no idea about our actual financial situation. They were creating a performance of prosperity while completely ignoring the fact that our prosperity was entirely dependent on my income. The most frustrating part was how naturally they assumed I'd make it all work. Not once during Mom's excited planning session did anyone ask whether we could afford her vision. Not once did anyone suggest that maybe we should scale back or create a budget that reflected our actual circumstances. They just talked and planned and dreamed, secure in the knowledge that somehow the money would appear when needed. Because it always did. Because I always made sure it did. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in my room with my laptop open, staring at my bank account balance and trying to figure out how to make Christmas work without completely decimating my savings. I'd been putting aside money for the past year, hoping to finally save enough for a security deposit on my own apartment. The balance had reached $8,000, the most money I'd ever had in my personal account. But Christmas was going to cost at least $1,500 on top of our regular monthly expenses. My December freelance income was already committed to January's mortgage payment and utilities. The Christmas budget would have to come from my savings, pushing my dream of independence back by several more months. I'd been postponing my own life for 3 years, telling myself it was temporary, that soon things would return to normal, and I could focus on my own goals. But sitting there in the dim light of my bedroom, surrounded by client files and family responsibility, I realized that normal was never coming back. This was normal now. Me working constantly to fund everyone else's dreams while my own got smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. The next morning, Mom handed me a detailed list of everything she wanted to accomplish before Christmas. She'd organized it by category: decorations, food, gifts, entertainment, and miscellaneous holiday expenses. Each section had multiple items with estimated costs that seemed wildly optimistic. She'd budgeted $50 for gift wrapping supplies, when I knew the elaborate vision she'd described would cost closer to $120. More concerning was the gift list. She'd allocated $150 per person for Emma and Tyler, which was more than I typically spent on myself for an entire year. Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda were getting something nice for hosting us last Easter, which translated to at least $200. The twins needed age-appropriate gifts that wouldn't seem cheap, another $150 total. For my parents, Mom had circled items in catalogs that ranged from a new leather recliner for Dad, to replace his worn-out chair to a jewelry set she'd admired at the department store. When I asked her about the total gift budget, she waved her hand dismissively and said we'd figure it out as we go. I'd become an expert at translating my family's financial euphemisms over the past 3 years. Figure it out as we go meant I'd put everything on my credit card and worry about paying it off later. We'll make it work meant I'd take on extra freelance projects and work longer hours. It's important to invest in family memories meant my personal financial goals would be sacrificed once again for everyone else's immediate gratification. The pattern had become so established that I'm not sure my family even consciously recognized what they were doing anymore. They'd learned that expressing their wants and needs enthusiastically enough would somehow result in those wants and needs being fulfilled. They didn't have to understand how the money appeared or what sacrifices were required to make it happen. They just had to want things, and I'd handle the rest. Emma had already started dropping hints about the art supplies she was hoping to find under the tree. Professional-grade paints and brushes that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budgets. She'd bookmarked items on expensive art supply websites and left her laptop open to those pages where I'd be sure to see them. When I mentioned that art supplies were pretty expensive, she looked genuinely confused and said she thought we were having a good Christmas this year. Tyler had taken a more direct approach, simply announcing that he needed a new gaming setup because his current equipment was hampering his ability to potentially stream content or develop gaming-related skills that might lead to future income opportunities. This was Tyler's way of justifying entertainment purchases as career investments. The gaming chair alone that he'd shown me cost more than my monthly car payment. Meanwhile, I was wearing the same rotation of work clothes I'd been cycling through. For 2 years and driving a car that needed repairs, I kept postponing because the money always seemed to be needed for something more urgent. My laptop was 3 years old and starting to show signs of strain from the constant design work I did on it. My bedroom furniture was the same set I'd had since high school, but somehow, pointing out these disparities felt selfish. My family wasn't intentionally taking advantage of me. They were just living their lives, pursuing their interests, and assuming that the financial foundation supporting everything would continue to exist without requiring any effort or sacrifice from them. The week before Christmas, Mom ramped up, her preparations to an almost manic level. She'd taken over the entire downstairs, covering every surface with craft supplies for her decorating projects. She'd ordered specialty foods online that arrived in expensive refrigerated packages. She'd hired a cleaning service to deep clean the house before our guests arrived, something we'd never done before, but which she declared essential for the impression she wanted to make. Each day brought new expenses that hadn't been included in her original budget. Emergency purchases of additional decorations when her first round didn't create the look she'd envisioned. Upgraded versions of planned menu items when she decided the original choices weren't impressive enough. Professional dry cleaning for outfits that didn't really need it, but which she wanted to look perfect for family photos. I found myself making daily trips to stores I'd never shopped at before, purchasing items that cost more than I typically spent on myself in a month. My credit card balance climbed steadily higher, but every time I tried to suggest scaling back or reconsidering some of the more expensive elements, Mom would get defensive and remind me that this was our first big family gathering in years, and we needed to make a good impression. The irony was that Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda weren't wealthy people. Mark worked as a postal supervisor, and Linda taught elementary school. They lived in a modest split-level home and drove practical cars that were several years old. They weren't coming to judge our financial status or expecting elaborate entertainment. They just wanted to spend time with family and catch up on each other's lives. But Mom had built up this Christmas gathering in her mind as our chance to prove that Dad's job loss hadn't affected our quality of life. She wanted to demonstrate that we were still the successful, comfortable family we'd always appeared to be. The performance had become more important than the actual experience of being together. 3 days before Christmas, the last of the preparations were falling into place. The house looked like something from a magazine, with carefully coordinated decorations and ambient lighting that created the perfect holiday atmosphere. The refrigerator was packed with expensive ingredients for the elaborate meals Mom had planned. Wrapped gifts were artfully arranged under the tree, each one tagged with handwritten labels in Mom's careful script. From the outside, everything looked perfect. We appeared to be a family that had it all together, who could afford to host extended family in style and create the kind of holiday memories that would be talked about for years to come. But I knew the real numbers. This Christmas was costing us close to $3,000 when everything was tallied up. Money that I'd earned through countless late nights and weekend projects, hours of work that my family had never acknowledged or appreciated. Money that could have gone toward my student loans, my car repairs, my long-delayed plans for independence. As I stood in our beautifully decorated living room the night before Christmas Eve, I felt a strange disconnection from everything around me. This was my money that had created this perfect holiday scene, but somehow I felt like an outsider looking in on someone else's celebration. I'd become so focused on making everyone else's dreams come true that I'd forgotten to have any dreams of my own. Emma was taking selfies with the tree in the background, posting them to social media with captions about being grateful for such a wonderful family. Tyler was testing the new sound system, clearly anticipating the gaming setup he expected to find under the tree tomorrow morning. Mom was doing final preparations in the kitchen, humming Christmas carols and radiating satisfaction about how perfectly everything had come together. Dad sat in his old recliner, remote in hand, occasionally commenting on how nice everything looked and how much Mark and Linda were going to enjoy their visit. He seemed more relaxed than he'd been in months, probably because the financial stress that usually shadowed our family gatherings was invisible this year. He didn't have to worry about whether we could afford to host guests or whether the house would look presentable. All of that had been handled seamlessly, without him having to think about it or contribute to it in any meaningful way. I went to bed that night with a strange mix of exhaustion and anticipation. I was tired from weeks of extra work to fund Christmas, tired from the emotional labor of managing everyone's expectations and desires, tired from being the invisible foundation that everything else rested on. But I was also looking forward to Christmas morning. Despite everything, I loved my family. I loved seeing them happy and excited. I loved the warmth of being together and the traditions we shared. Part of me hoped that maybe this year would be different. Maybe someone would acknowledge what I'd done to make this Christmas possible. Maybe I'd finally feel like an appreciated member of the family, rather than an overlooked financial resource. I had no idea that Christmas morning would bring the words that would change everything between us forever. Christmas Eve night, I barely slept. Not because of excitement like when I was a child, but because my mind kept racing through financial calculations and logistics for the day ahead. Uncle Mark, Aunt Linda, and their twin daughters would arrive around 11 in the morning. I'd need to have the fancy breakfast spread ready by then, the one Mom had planned with fresh pastries from the expensive bakery downtown, real maple syrup, and the imported coffee she'd insisted would make the right impression. I'd set my alarm for 6, but I was already awake at 5:30, staring at the ceiling and listening to the old house settle around me. Outside, a light snow was falling, the kind of picture-perfect Christmas morning snow that would make Mom happy because it would look beautiful in the family photos she was planning to take throughout the day. By 6, I was in the kitchen, starting the first pot of coffee and preheating the oven for the breakfast pastries. The house was quiet except for the humming of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards above my head. This early morning solitude had become precious to me over the years, the only time when I could move through the house without someone needing something from me or adding items to my ever-expanding mental list of responsibilities. I'd always been an early riser, but since becoming the family's financial backbone, these quiet morning hours had evolved into my planning and preparation time. I'd make lists, check bank account balances, respond to client emails, and mentally organize everything that needed to happen that day. It was the only time that felt entirely my own, before the demands and expectations of everyone else crowded in. As I arranged the pastries on the decorative platters Mom had bought specifically for this breakfast, I found myself thinking about Christmas mornings from my childhood. Back then, the anticipation had been purely about presents and surprises, about the magic of finding gifts that seemed to appear overnight under the tree. The financial mechanics of Christmas had been completely invisible to me, handled by parents who somehow made everything work without me having to think about it or contribute to it. Now I was the one making the magic happen, but somewhere along the way the magic had disappeared for me. Instead of excitement, I felt the weight of responsibility. Instead of surprises, I knew exactly what was under the tree because I'd purchased, wrapped, and arranged everything myself. Instead of feeling cared for and thought about, I felt like the stage manager of everyone else's holiday experience. Emma was the first one downstairs, appearing around 7:30 in new Christmas pajamas that I'd bought for her without her knowledge, part of Mom's vision for the perfect family photos. She poured herself coffee and settled at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone and occasionally commenting on the breakfast preparations. "Everything looks amazing, Rachel," she said, though she didn't look up from her screen. Mom's going to be so happy with how this turned out." The phrasing struck me as odd. Not, "You did an amazing job," or "Thank you for getting up early to handle this," but a comment about how Mom would feel about the results, as if the work I'd done was somehow for Mom's benefit rather than for our family's shared experience. Tyler emerged around 8, drawn downstairs by the smell of coffee and the promise of food. He grabbed a pastry from the tray I was still arranging and bit into it while standing in the middle of the kitchen. "These are incredible," he said with his mouth full. "Where did you get them?" "The French bakery on Market Street," I replied, moving the remaining pastries to replace the one he'd taken. "Oh, the expensive place. Cool. I didn't know we were doing fancy Christmas this year." That phrase hit me wrong somehow. We were doing fancy Christmas, as if he were just an observer of family decisions, rather than someone who might contribute to making those decisions possible. As if the choice to spend extra money on fancy pastries was something that had happened to him, rather than something that required effort and sacrifice from someone in the family. Mom appeared around 8:30, already dressed and made up despite the early hour. She'd clearly put effort into her appearance for the family gathering, wearing a new sweater that still had the tags attached when I'd wrapped it for her 3 days ago. She surveyed the breakfast preparations with satisfaction, adjusting the placement of a few items and nodding approvingly at the overall presentation. "Perfect," she said, more to herself than to me. "This is exactly the impression I wanted to make." Again, that disconnect between the work and the credit. I'd been up for 3 hours preparing everything, but her satisfaction was about the impression she was making, rather than appreciation for the effort I'd put in. It was a small thing, but these small things had been accumulating for 3 years, building into a larger sense that my contributions were invisible, even when they were essential. Dad joined us around 9, moving slowly and looking like he was still waking up. He accepted a cup of coffee gratefully and settled into his usual spot at the kitchen table, surveying the breakfast spread with mild surprise. "You girls really went all out this year," he said, and I noticed that he included Mom in the credit for work she hadn't done. It wasn't intentional, probably, just an assumption that the elaborate breakfast had been a collaborative effort rather than something I'd handled entirely on my own. "Rachel did most of the work," Mom said, but in a tone that suggested I'd volunteered for extra duties rather than carried the entire load. "She's always been so helpful with these kinds of things." Helpful. That word sat wrong with me too. As if covering $3,000 in Christmas expenses and doing all the preparation work was simply being helpful rather than carrying the primary responsibility for making Christmas happen at all. Uncle Mark and his family arrived right on schedule at 11, bringing with them the energy and excitement that comes with family reunions. The twins, Sophia and Grace, were now 16 and had grown into confident teenagers who filled the house with laughter and chatter. Aunt Linda looked exactly the same as always, practical and warm, the kind of person who brought homemade cookies even though she was a guest. Uncle Mark hugged everyone enthusiastically and made the kinds of compliments about the house and decorations that Mom had been hoping for. He was genuinely impressed by the beautiful breakfast spread and the perfectly coordinated holiday decorations, commenting several times about how wonderful everything looked and how much effort must have gone into creating such a lovely celebration. "Patricia, you've really outdone yourself this year," he said to Mom, who beamed with pride and accepted the compliment graciously. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd been experiencing more frequently over the past few months. It wasn't quite anger, but it wasn't acceptance either. Something between frustration and resignation, tinged with a growing awareness that the dynamic I'd accepted as normal was actually deeply unfair. But this was Christmas morning, and Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda were here, and everyone was happy and excited. I pushed down the uncomfortable feelings and focused on playing my role as the responsible daughter who had everything under control. We gathered in the living room for present opening, a tradition that had been carefully orchestrated by Mom to create the perfect photo opportunities she wanted. The twins went first, exclaiming over the gifts I'd chosen and wrapped for them, followed by the adults exchanging presents with appropriate levels of surprise and gratitude. Emma opened her expensive art supplies with genuine excitement, immediately planning how she'd use the professional grade paints and brushes. Tyler was thrilled with his new gaming equipment, already talking about how it would improve his streaming potential. Mom loved the jewelry set I'd bought for her, holding it up to catch the light and modeling it for Aunt Linda's admiration. Dad seemed genuinely moved by the new recliner that had been assembled in the garage and would be brought in later as his big surprise. It was the most expensive single gift I'd bought, but seeing his reaction reminded me why I'd been willing to stretch the budget for it. He'd been sitting in that old chair for 5 years, and it had become a symbol of everything he'd lost when his job disappeared. When it came time for my gifts, I opened them with enthusiasm that felt only partially forced. Mom had given me a nice sweater from a store I'd never shopped at myself. Emma had made me a small painting of our house, which was thoughtful even though it had cost her nothing but time. Tyler had given me a gift card to a bookstore, probably purchased at the last minute, but still considerate since he knew I loved to read. Dad's gift was a framed photo of our family from last Christmas, which touched me more than I'd expected. He'd clearly put thought into choosing a picture where everyone looked happy and relaxed, and he'd written a note on the back about how proud he was of the woman I'd become. For a moment, sitting there surrounded by wrapping paper and family and the warm glow of Christmas morning, I felt genuinely grateful and content. This was why I worked so hard to make these moments possible. This feeling of connection and love and shared joy was worth the sacrifice and effort it required. Then Uncle Mark asked the question that would change everything. We'd moved into the dining room for the elaborate brunch Mom had planned, and conversation had turned to catching up on each other's lives. Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda shared updates about their jobs, the twins' school activities, their recent vacation to Myrtle Beach. Emma talked about her art projects and her plans to apply for gallery showings in the spring. Tyler discussed his ideas for starting a YouTube channel, or maybe going back to school for computer programming. The conversation had a comfortable, familiar rhythm, the kind of easy family banter that happens when people who care about each other get together to share their lives. But then Uncle Mark turned to Dad with a question that seemed innocent enough on the surface. "How are you holding up with the job situation, David? I know it's been a tough few years." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I saw Mom's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. This wasn't a topic they liked to discuss in detail, even with family members who knew about the unemployment situation. "We're managing," Dad said carefully. "It's been an adjustment, but we're getting by." "That's good to hear," Uncle Mark continued. "I've been worried about you guys, especially with the house payments and everything. I know how stressful financial uncertainty can be." Aunt Linda nodded sympathetically. "When Mark was laid off for those 6 months a few years ago, it was so hard. Even with unemployment benefits, we had to make some real sacrifices to keep up with our mortgage." "Oh, we've been fine," Mom said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "We've found ways to manage without making major changes to our lifestyle." "Uncle," Mark looked confused. "Really? How have you managed that? I mean, unemployment benefits don't typically cover a full salary, especially for this long." There was a moment of silence around the table. Emma suddenly became very interested in her food. Tyler was staring at his phone. Dad was looking down at his hands. "Well," Mom said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, "we've all been contributing where we can, making sacrifices, you know." "All of you?" Aunt Linda asked gently. She wasn't trying to be nosy, just trying to understand how we'd managed to maintain our lifestyle when she knew how difficult their much shorter period of unemployment had been. Another pause. This time, Uncle Mark looked directly at me. "Rachel, you just graduated college a few years ago, right? Are you working now?" "Yes." I said simply. I work downtown at a marketing firm, and I do freelance graphic design on the side. That's wonderful, Aunt Linda said warmly. It must feel good to be starting your career and building your independence. The word independence hung in the air like a question none of us wanted to answer. Because the truth was, I had no independence at all. Every dollar I earned went toward supporting a family of 5 adults, leaving me with less autonomy than I'd had as a college student. Rachel's been very helpful, Mom said again, using that same word that minimized my contribution. She's good with money and organization. Uncle Mark was clearly trying to piece together information that didn't quite add up. He knew Dad had been unemployed for 3 years. He could see that our house was beautifully maintained and decorated, that we were hosting an expensive Christmas celebration, that nobody seemed to be living like a family dealing with serious financial hardship. So, everyone's working and contributing to household expenses? He asked, still trying to understand. Well, Emma said carefully, I have a part-time job at a coffee shop. It doesn't pay much, but I'm focusing on building my art portfolio. And Tyler? I'm between opportunities right now, Tyler said, which was his way of saying he was unemployed by choice. Exploring different directions, you know? Uncle Mark looked at Mom. And Patricia, are you working outside the home? Now? Mom's discomfort was becoming more obvious. I've been focusing on managing the household and supporting David through this transition period. It's a full-time job keeping everything organized and running smoothly. The math wasn't adding up, and Uncle Mark was clearly confused about how a family with 1 unemployed parent, 2 underemployed adult children, and 1 non-working parent was maintaining the lifestyle he was observing. Then his expression changed as understanding dawned. Rachel, he said slowly, are you covering most of the household expenses? The question hung in the air like a confession waiting to be made. Everyone at the table knew the answer, but nobody wanted to say it out loud because saying it would make the dynamic impossible to ignore. I help where I can, I said, trying to deflect the uncomfortable attention. Help how much? Uncle Mark? Press gently. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone, but he clearly sensed that something significant was being left unsaid. She contributes, Mom said quickly. We all contribute in our own ways. But Uncle Mark was looking at me directly, and I could see in his expression that he understood more than my family realized. He'd done the math in his head. He knew what it cost to maintain a household like ours, and he could see that I was the only one at the table with a real income. Rachel, he said quietly, how much of the household budget are you covering? The directness of the question caught me off guard. Nobody had ever asked me to quantify my contribution before. My family had always preferred to keep the financial arrangements vague and unofficial, allowing everyone to maintain comfortable illusions about the true nature of our situation. Most of it, I said simply, because there was no point in lying anymore. The silence that followed was profound. Aunt Linda looked shocked. The twins seemed uncomfortable, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. Dad was staring at his plate like he wished he could disappear. Most of it? Uncle Mark repeated. Rachel, you mean you're paying the mortgage, utilities, groceries, everything? Not everything, I said, trying to downplay the reality even as I was being forced to acknowledge it. But the major expenses, yes. For how long? About 3 years. Uncle Mark sat back in his chair, clearly processing this information. So you've been supporting a family of 5 on your entry-level salary for 3 years while everyone else. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication was clear, and it hung in the air like an accusation nobody wanted to address directly. Now, wait a minute, Mom said, her defensive tone indicating that she felt attacked. That's not entirely fair. We've all been doing our part. Rachel might handle more of the financial responsibilities, But I manage the household, and David is actively looking for work, and the kids are figuring out their career paths. Patricia, Uncle Mark said carefully. Rachel is 26 years old. She should be building her own life, not supporting 4 adults who are capable of supporting themselves. It's not that simple, Mom replied, and I could hear the edge in her voice that indicated this conversation was heading toward conflict. But for the first time in 3 years, someone outside our family was acknowledging what I'd been too afraid or too loyal to say myself. Uncle Mark could see what I'd been unable to admit, that I wasn't helping my family through a temporary crisis. I was enabling 4 adults to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives. The moment of recognition felt like something breaking open inside me. Not breaking apart, but breaking open. Like a door I didn't know existed had suddenly swung wide, letting light into a space that had been dark for too long. "You're right," I said quietly, and the words felt strange in my mouth. "You're absolutely right." The words, "You're absolutely right," seemed to echo in the dining room, followed by a silence so complete I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway. Everyone was staring at me now, and I realized I'd just acknowledged something that my family had spent 3 years carefully avoiding discussing directly. Mom's face had gone pale, then flushed red. Her carefully applied Christmas makeup couldn't hide the combination of embarrassment and anger that was spreading across her features. This conversation was revealing truths she'd preferred to keep buried under euphemisms and vague references to everyone contributing in their own way. "Rachel," she said, her voice tight with warning, "I think you're being dramatic. We're a family. Families help each other." But Uncle Mark wasn't letting it go. "Patricia, there's a difference between family members helping each other and one person carrying the entire financial burden for 4 adults. That's not fair to Rachel, and it's not healthy for any of you." "You don't understand our situation," Dad interjected, finally looking up from his plate. "It's more complicated than it appears from the outside." "David," Uncle Mark said gently but firmly, "I've been unemployed. I know how hard it is. But there's a difference between temporary family support and allowing your adult daughter to sacrifice her entire future to subsidize everyone else's lifestyle." Aunt Linda had been quiet during this exchange, but now she leaned forward slightly. "Rachel, honey, do you have any savings? Any plans for your own future?" The question hit me like a physical blow because it forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding thinking about. I'd had savings, I'd had plans, but they'd been steadily eroded by 3 years of putting everyone else's needs before my own. "I had savings," I said quietly. "I've been trying to save for my own apartment, but..." I gestured vaguely at the elaborate Christmas spread around us, the expensive decorations, the gifts that had cost more than my monthly food budget. "But you keep spending your savings on everyone else," Uncle Mark finished. "It's not that simple," Emma said suddenly, her voice defensive. "Rachel chooses to help us. Nobody's forcing her." The word "chooses" sparked something hot and uncomfortable in my chest. As if I'd had real choices. As if saying no to helping with the mortgage payment was an option when the alternative was watching my family lose their home. As if I'd chosen to work 70-hour weeks to fund everyone else's dreams while my own got smaller and smaller. "Emma," Uncle Mark said, "when someone is covering your living expenses, they're not choosing to help you. They're choosing between helping you and watching you face consequences. That's not the same thing as having a real choice." "We didn't ask her to pay for everything," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You didn't have to ask," Aunt Linda replied. "When bills come due and only one person in the household has income, the responsibility falls to that person by default. That's not fair, especially when the other adults in the household are capable of working." The conversation was spiraling into territory that felt dangerous and unfamiliar. For 3 years, my family had operated under an unspoken agreement that we wouldn't examine our financial arrangement too closely. We'd all pretended that it was temporary, that everyone was doing their best, that this was just how families supported each other during difficult times. But Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda were forcing us to look directly at what we'd been avoiding. They were naming the reality that I was supporting 4 adults who had arranged their lives around my willingness to carry the financial burden alone. "Look," Mom said, her voice rising slightly, "I don't appreciate having our family dynamics judged by people who don't understand our circumstances. We've been through a difficult period, and Rachel has been generous enough to help us get through it. That's what family does." "For 3 years?" Uncle Mark asked. "Patricia, at what point does temporary help become permanent dependency?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, because that's exactly what had happened, wasn't it? Temporary help had become permanent dependency, and somewhere along the way, everyone had stopped expecting it to change. "We're working toward independence," Mom said, but even she seemed to hear how hollow that sounded. "How?" Aunt Linda asked gently. "What specific steps are you taking to become financially independent?" Another silence, because there weren't any specific steps. There were vague plans and someday intentions, but no concrete actions being taken to change our situation. "David is actively job hunting," Mom said. "For 3 years?" Uncle Mark asked. "The job market is difficult," Dad said defensively. "I know it is," Uncle Mark replied, "but there are jobs available. Maybe not the exact job you want, or the salary you're hoping for, but there are ways to earn income." "I'm not going to take just any job," Dad said, and there was pride in his voice that felt misplaced given our circumstances. "I have 15 years of experience. I'm not starting over at minimum wage." "But you're comfortable letting your daughter support you while you wait for the perfect opportunity?" Uncle Mark asked. The directness of the question seemed to hit Dad like a slap. His face reddened, and for a moment, I thought he might get angry. But instead, he just looked deflated. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent," he said quietly. "But it has become permanent," Aunt Linda pointed out. "And in the meantime, Rachel is missing out on the experiences she should be having in her 20s. She's not building her own life because she's too busy supporting everyone else's." I felt tears building behind my eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. Someone was finally saying out loud what I'd been thinking but hadn't been able to articulate. I wasn't building my own life. I was stuck in a holding pattern, working, constantly to maintain everyone else's comfort while my own dreams got smaller and more distant. "Rachel's doing fine," Emma said. "She has a good job. She's building her career." The kitchen clock struck 7 as I finished arranging the last of the breakfast pastries on Mom's best serving platters. The French bakery had cost me nearly $80 for what I could have made at home for $15. But Mom had insisted that store-bought wouldn't create the right impression for Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda's visit. Everything had to be perfect, elevated, worthy of the holiday photos she planned to post across her social media accounts. The house smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, a carefully orchestrated combination of scented candles, fresh coffee, and warming pastries that created the exact ambiance Mom had envisioned. She'd been planning this Christmas morning for weeks, sketching out table arrangements and timing schedules that would ensure everything unfolded seamlessly from the moment our guests arrived. I'd been awake since 5:30, moving quietly through the house while everyone else slept, preparing for a day that would showcase our family as successful and harmonious. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was working alone to create the illusion of family togetherness, but this had become my normal routine for any gathering or celebration that mattered to Mom. Emma wandered into the kitchen around 7:15, already dressed in the coordinated Christmas outfit I'd purchased for her without her knowledge. Mom had wanted everyone to look put together for the family photos, which meant I'd spent an additional $300 on new clothes for everyone except myself. I was wearing the same red sweater I'd worn to Christmas dinner for the past 2 years, but nobody seemed to notice or care about my repetitive wardrobe choices. "Morning," Emma mumbled, pouring herself coffee from the pot I'd started an hour earlier. She settled at the kitchen table with her phone, immediately scrolling through social media posts from friends who were documenting their own Christmas mornings. "The pastries look incredible," she added without looking up. "Mom's going to love how everything turned out." That phrasing had become typical over the years. Not appreciation for my effort, but anticipation of Mom's approval. As if I were performing these tasks to earn Mom's satisfaction rather than contributing to our shared family experience. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't quite articulate why it bothered me so much. Tyler appeared next, drawn by the smell of food and the promise of caffeine. He grabbed a Danish from the carefully arranged display, taking a large bite while standing in the middle of the kitchen. "These are amazing," he said with his mouth full. "Way better than the ones we usually get." "They're from that place downtown," I replied, moving to rearrange the remaining pastries to fill the gap he'd created. "The expensive French place? Nice. I guess we're really doing it up this year." Again, that passive observation. "We're really doing it up this year?" As if he were commenting on someone else's decisions, rather than benefiting from expenditures I'd made specifically to enhance his Christmas experience. The gaming setup I'd purchased for him was hidden in the garage, waiting to be assembled and presented as his main gift. It had cost more than my rent would have been if I'd been living independently, but Tyler had no awareness of the financial sacrifice involved in making his Christmas wishes come true. Mom emerged around 8, already fully dressed and made up despite the early hour. She'd clearly put significant effort into her appearance, wearing a new emerald green dress that complemented the holiday decorations perfectly. Her hair was styled, her makeup was flawless, and she moved through the kitchen with the confident energy of someone who was proud of what she'd accomplished. "Everything looks wonderful, Rachel," she said, surveying the breakfast preparations with satisfaction. "This is exactly what I envisioned." She began making small adjustments to the presentation, moving serving spoons and repositioning napkin holders to create the precise aesthetic she wanted. I watched her perfect what I'd already prepared, adding her personal touches to work I'd completed while she slept. "Uncle Mark and Linda are going to be so impressed," she continued, stepping back to admire the overall effect. "It's been too long since we've been able to host family properly." The word properly carried weight that made me uncomfortable. As if our previous gatherings had been inadequate. As if this level of expense and effort was necessary to meet some standard of family hospitality that I hadn't understood before. But the truth was, Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda had always seemed perfectly happy with our simpler celebrations. They came to see us, not to judge our decorating budget or evaluate our menu choices. Dad joined us around 8:30, moving slowly and looking like he was still adjusting to being awake. He accepted a cup of coffee gratefully and settled into his usual spot at the kitchen table, taking in the elaborate breakfast spread with mild surprise. "You ladies have really outdone yourselves this year," he said, and I noticed again how he distributed credit for work that I'd done alone. Not intentionally, probably, but reflexively assuming that the effort had been shared when it hadn't been. "Rachel handled most of the preparations," Mom said, but in a tone that suggested I'd been particularly helpful rather than entirely responsible. "She's always been so good at organizing these kinds of events." The word organizing minimized what I'd actually done. I hadn't just organized. I'd funded, planned, shopped, prepared, and executed every aspect of the Christmas morning experience. But somehow, acknowledging the full scope of my contribution felt like it would make everyone uncomfortable, so we maintained the fiction that I'd simply been unusually helpful. Uncle Mark, Aunt Linda, and their twin daughters arrived precisely at 11, bringing with them the energy and excitement that comes with family reunions. The girls, Sophia and Grace, were now 16 and had developed into confident teenagers who filled the house with laughter and animated conversation. Aunt Linda looked exactly as I remembered her, practical and warm, carrying a container of homemade cookies despite being a guest. Uncle Mark embraced everyone enthusiastically, making genuine compliments about the house and decorations that clearly pleased Mom. He seemed impressed by the breakfast spread and the attention to detail that had gone into preparing for their visit, commenting several times about how beautiful everything looked. "Patricia, this is incredible," he said to Mom, who accepted the praise graciously. "You've created such a lovely atmosphere. This must have taken weeks of planning." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest as Mom beamed with pride at compliments for efforts she hadn't made. It wasn't that I needed credit or recognition exactly, but the disconnect between reality and perception was becoming harder to ignore. The beautiful Christmas morning that Uncle Mark was admiring had been created entirely by my time, money, and energy. But somehow Mom was receiving the acknowledgement for it. We gathered in the living room for gift opening, a carefully choreographed event that Mom had planned to create optimal photo opportunities. She'd positioned herself strategically to capture everyone's reactions, particularly when the expensive gifts were revealed. The twins went first, expressing genuine delight over the presents I'd chosen for them, followed by the adults exchanging gifts with appropriate levels of surprise and gratitude. Emma opened her art supplies with authentic excitement, immediately, discussing how she planned to use the professional-grade materials. The supplies had cost more than I typically spent on myself in 3 months, but seeing her happiness reminded me why I'd been willing to stretch the budget. Tyler was thrilled with his gaming equipment, already talking about how it would enhance his streaming capabilities and potentially lead to income opportunities. Mom loved the jewelry set I'd selected, holding it up to catch the morning light, and modeling it for Aunt Linda's admiration. She seemed genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, though she had no idea how many extra freelance projects I'd taken on to afford it. Dad appeared moved by the new recliner that would be brought in later as his surprise gift, the most expensive single purchase I'd made this Christmas. When it came time for my presents, I opened them with enthusiasm that felt genuine in the moment. Mom had chosen a beautiful cashmere scarf from a department store I'd never shopped at myself. Emma had painted me a small watercolor of our neighborhood, which was thoughtful and personal even though it had cost her nothing but time. Tyler had given me a gift card to a bookstore, probably purchased last minute but still considerate since he knew I loved reading. Dad's gift touched me more than I'd expected. He'd framed a photo from last year's Christmas, one where everyone looked relaxed and happy, and he'd written a note on the back about how proud he was of the responsible, caring woman I'd become. The sentiment felt genuine, and for a moment, I was reminded of why I worked so hard to keep our family together. Sitting there surrounded by wrapping paper and laughter, watching the twins compare their gifts while Uncle Mark helped Dad figure out the coffee maker I'd bought him, I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. This was why I sacrificed so much, to make these moments possible. This feeling of connection and love and shared joy made the financial stress and exhaustion worth it. But then the conversation shifted, as family conversations do, from presents to catching up on life updates. Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda shared news about their jobs, the twins' school activities, their recent vacation to the Outer Banks. Emma discussed her latest art projects and her hopes for getting some pieces into a local gallery. Tyler talked about his ideas for starting a podcast or maybe returning to school for a computer science degree. The conversation had a comfortable rhythm, the kind of easy family exchange that happens when people who care about each other get together to share their lives. Everyone seemed relaxed and happy, basking in the warmth of Christmas morning and the pleasure of being together. Then Uncle Mark asked the question that would change everything. "David," he said, turning to my father with genuine concern, "how are you holding up with the employment situation? I know these past few years have been challenging." The question wasn't meant to be intrusive or uncomfortable. Uncle Mark had been worried about our family since Dad lost his job, and he was simply checking in on how we were managing. But I saw Dad shift uncomfortably in his chair, and I noticed Mom's smile become slightly forced. "We're doing well," Dad replied carefully. "It's been an adjustment, but we're managing fine." That's good to hear, Uncle Mark continued. I've been concerned about how you're handling the mortgage and household expenses. When I was laid off for those few months, a couple years ago, even with unemployment benefits, Linda and I had to make some real sacrifices to keep up with our bills. Aunt Linda nodded sympathetically. It was so stressful, even for that short period. I can't imagine how difficult it must be to manage for this long. Oh, we've been fine, Mom said quickly, perhaps too quickly. We've found ways to manage, without having to make major lifestyle changes. Uncle Mark looked puzzled. Really? How have you managed that? I mean, unemployment benefits usually cover only a fraction of regular income, especially after this much time. There was a moment of silence around the room. Emma suddenly became very interested in examining her new paintbrushes. Tyler was scrolling through his phone. Dad was staring at his hands folded in his lap. Well, Mom said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. We've all been contributing where we can. Everyone's been making sacrifices and helping out. All of you? Aunt Linda asked gently. She wasn't trying to pry, just genuinely curious about how we'd managed to maintain what appeared to be a comfortable lifestyle during such an extended period of unemployment. Another pause. This time, Uncle Mark looked directly at me. Rachel, you graduated a few years ago, right? Are you working now? Yes, I replied simply. I work at Henderson Associates downtown, and I do freelance graphic design work on evenings and weekends. That's wonderful, Aunt Linda said warmly. It must feel good to be starting your career and building your independence. The word independence hung in the air like a question that couldn't be answered honestly. Because the truth was, I had no independence whatsoever. Every dollar I earned went directly into supporting a household of 5 adults, leaving me with less financial autonomy than I'd had as a college student with a part-time job. Rachel's been very helpful, Mom said, using that familiar word that minimized my actual contribution. She's always been good with budgets and financial planning. Uncle Mark was clearly trying to piece together information that didn't quite make sense. He could see that our house was beautifully maintained, that we were hosting an expensive Christmas celebration, that nobody appeared to be living like a family experiencing serious financial hardship. But he also knew that Dad had been unemployed for 3 years. So everyone is working and contributing to household expenses? He asked, still trying to understand our situation. Well, Emma said carefully, I work part-time at a coffee shop, downtown. It doesn't pay much, but I'm really focused on developing my art career right now. And Tyler? I'm exploring different opportunities, Tyler said, which was his euphemism for being unemployed by choice. Taking time to figure out the right direction, you know? Uncle Mark looked at Mom expectantly. And, Patricia, are you working outside? The home now? Mom's discomfort was becoming more obvious. I've been managing the household and supporting David through this transition. It's really a full-time job keeping everything organized and running smoothly. I could see Uncle Mark doing calculations in his head, trying to make the numbers work. A family with 1 unemployed parent, 2 underemployed adult children, and 1 non-working parent shouldn't have been able to maintain the lifestyle he was observing. The math didn't add up unless... His expression changed as understanding began to dawn. Rachel, he said slowly, are you covering most of the household expenses? The question hung in the air like a confession waiting to be made. Everyone at the table knew the answer, but nobody wanted to say it out loud because acknowledging it would make our family dynamic impossible to ignore or justify. I help where I can, I said, trying to deflect the uncomfortable attention. Help how much? Uncle Mark pressed gently. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone, but he clearly sensed that something significant was being left unsaid. She contributes her fair share, Mom said quickly. We all contribute in different ways. But Uncle Mark was looking directly at me, with an expression of growing understanding and concern. "Rachel," he said quietly, "how much of the household budget are you actually covering?" The directness of the question caught me completely off guard. Nobody had ever asked me to quantify my contribution before. My family had always preferred to keep our financial arrangements vague and undefined, allowing everyone to maintain comfortable illusions about the true nature of our situation. I looked around the table at faces that suddenly seemed expectant and nervous. Emma was biting her lip. Tyler had put down his phone. Dad was staring at his coffee cup like it contained the answers to life's most difficult questions. Mom was looking at me with an expression that seemed to be warning me not to make this conversation more uncomfortable than it already was. But Uncle Mark's question deserved an honest answer, and suddenly I was tired of protecting everyone else's comfort by avoiding the truth. "Most of it," I said simply. The silence that followed felt profound and heavy. Aunt Linda looked genuinely shocked. The twins seemed to sense the tension without fully understanding what was happening. Dad appeared to be trying to disappear into his chair. "Most of it?" Uncle Mark repeated, his voice carefully controlled. "Rachel, you mean you're paying the mortgage, utilities, groceries, everything?" "The major expenses, yes." "For how long?" "About 3 years." Uncle Mark sat back in his chair, clearly processing this information with growing disbelief and concern. "So, you've been supporting a family of 5 on your entry-level salary for 3 years while everyone else—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like an accusation that nobody wanted to address directly. "Now hold on," Mom said, her defensive tone indicating that she felt under attack. "That's not entirely accurate. We've all been doing our part in different ways. Rachel might handle more of the financial responsibilities, but I manage the entire household. David is actively searching for employment, and the kids are working on building their careers." "Patricia," Uncle Mark said carefully, "Rachel is 26 years old. She should be building her own life, saving for her own future, not supporting 4 capable adults who could be supporting themselves." "It's not that simple," Mom replied, and I could hear the edge in her voice that indicated this conversation was heading toward conflict territory. "We're a family. Families help each other through difficult times. There's a difference between helping family through temporary difficulties and allowing one person to sacrifice their entire future while everyone else avoids responsibility," Uncle Mark replied firmly. For the first time in 3 years, someone outside our family was saying what I'd been unable to articulate even to myself. I wasn't helping my family through a crisis. I was enabling 4 adults to avoid facing the consequences of their choices and inaction. "You're right," I said quietly, and the words felt strange and powerful in my mouth. "You're absolutely right." The words, "you're absolutely right," seemed to reverberate through the dining room, creating a silence so complete that the only sound was the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, their surprise at my sudden agreement with Uncle Mark's assessment palpable in the air between us. Mom's face had gone from flushed to pale in the span of seconds. Her carefully applied Christmas makeup couldn't disguise the combination of shock and anger that was spreading across her features. This conversation was exposing truths she'd worked hard to keep buried under layers of family loyalty and financial euphemisms. "Rachel," she said, her voice tight with warning, "I think you're being overly dramatic. This is Christmas morning. We're supposed to be celebrating as a family." But Uncle Mark wasn't going to let the moment pass. "Patricia, there's nothing dramatic about acknowledging that one person shouldn't be financially responsible for 4 capable adults. That's not healthy for anyone involved." "You don't understand our situation," Dad interjected, finally looking up from his coffee cup. "It's more complicated than it appears from an outside perspective." "David," Uncle Mark said, his voice gentle but firm, "I've been unemployed. I know exactly how difficult and demoralizing it can be. But there's a significant difference between temporary family support during a crisis and allowing your daughter to sacrifice her entire future to subsidize everyone else's lifestyle indefinitely. Aunt Linda leaned forward slightly, her expression filled with concern. Rachel, honey, do you have any personal savings? Any plans for your own apartment? Your own future? The question hit me like a physical blow because it forced me to confront something I'd been deliberately avoiding thinking about. I'd had savings once. I'd had plans and dreams and goals that extended beyond managing my family's financial crisis. But those had been steadily eroded over 3 years of putting everyone else's immediate needs ahead of my long-term aspirations. I had savings, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I've been trying to save for my own place, but... I gestured vaguely at the elaborate Christmas spread surrounding us, the expensive decorations, the costly gifts that represented months of extra freelance work. But you keep spending your savings on everyone else, Uncle Mark finished, his tone understanding rather than accusatory. It's not that straightforward, Emma said suddenly, her voice defensive and sharp. Rachel chooses to help us. Nobody forces her to pay for things. The word chooses ignited something hot and uncomfortable in my chest. As if I'd had genuine choices all along. As if declining to cover the mortgage payment was a viable option when the alternative meant watching my family lose their home. As if I'd chosen to work 70-hour weeks funding everyone else's comfort while my own dreams grew smaller and more distant with each passing month. Emma, Uncle Mark said patiently, when someone is covering your basic living expenses, they're not really choosing to help you. They're choosing between helping you and watching you face serious consequences. That's not the same thing as having real choices. We never asked her to pay for everything, Tyler added, but his voice lacked conviction, and he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. You didn't have to ask, Aunt Linda replied gently. When bills arrive and only one person in the household has sufficient income, the financial responsibility falls to that person automatically. That's not fair, especially when the other adults in the house are perfectly capable of working. The conversation was spiraling into territory that felt both dangerous and liberating. For 3 years, my family had operated under an unspoken agreement that we wouldn't examine our financial arrangement too closely or critically. We'd all pretended that the situation was temporary, that everyone was contributing their best efforts, that this was simply how loving families supported each other during challenging periods. But Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda were forcing us to look directly at what we'd been carefully avoiding. They were naming the reality that I'd been supporting 4 capable adults who had gradually arranged their entire lives around my willingness to carry the financial burden alone. Look, Mom said, her voice rising slightly with frustration. I don't appreciate having our family dynamics criticized by people who don't fully understand our circumstances. We've been navigating a difficult situation, and Rachel has been generous, enough to help us through it. That's what families do for each other. For 3 years? Uncle Mark asked pointedly. Patricia, at what point does temporary assistance become permanent financial dependency? The question hung in the air like a challenge that demanded an honest response, because that's exactly what had happened, wasn't it? What had started as temporary emergency assistance had gradually transformed into permanent financial dependency, and somewhere along the way, everyone had stopped expecting or working toward changing the arrangement. We're actively working toward financial independence, Mom said, but even she seemed to hear how hollow and unconvincing those words sounded. How specifically? Aunt Linda asked gently. What concrete steps are you taking to become financially self-sufficient? Another uncomfortable silence descended over the table, because there weren't any specific steps being taken. There were vague intentions and someday plans, but no concrete actions or measurable progress toward changing our financial dynamic. David is actively job hunting, Mom said defensively. For 3 years? Uncle Mark asked, his tone more incredulous than judgmental. The job market has been extremely challenging, Dad said, his defensiveness evident. Good positions are difficult to find, especially for someone my age. I understand that, Uncle Mark replied. But there are employment opportunities available. Maybe not the exact position you're hoping for or the salary you'd prefer, but there are ways to earn income and contribute to household expenses. I'm not going to accept just any minimum wage job, Dad said, and there was wounded pride in his voice that felt misplaced given our family's circumstances. I have 15 years of specialized experience and skills. I'm not starting over at the bottom of some random career ladder. But you're comfortable allowing your daughter to support you financially while you wait for the ideal opportunity to present itself? Uncle Mark asked, his directness cutting through Dad's justifications. The bluntness of the question seemed to hit Dad like a slap across the face. His expression shifted from defensive to deflated, and for a moment I thought he might become angry or walk away from the conversation entirely. Instead, he just looked smaller and older than I'd ever seen him. It wasn't supposed to become permanent, he said quietly, almost to himself. But it has become permanent, Aunt Linda pointed out gently. And meanwhile, Rachel is missing out on all the experiences and opportunities she should be having in her 20s. She's not building her own independent life because she's too busy supporting everyone else's. I felt tears building behind my eyes, not from sadness but from profound relief. Someone was finally articulating what I'd been thinking, but hadn't been able to express even to myself. I wasn't building my own life or pursuing my own goals. I was stuck in an endless holding pattern, working constantly to maintain everyone else's comfort and stability, while my personal aspirations became increasingly distant and unrealistic. Rachel's doing fine, Emma said stubbornly. She has a good job. She's building her career. It's not like she's suffering or anything. Emma, Uncle Mark said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Having a job isn't the same thing as building a life. Rachel should be saving money for her own future, dating, traveling, maybe buying her own home or pursuing additional education. Instead, she's working multiple jobs to support 4 adults who should be supporting themselves. She gets satisfaction from helping family, Mom interjected. Rachel has always been the responsible one, the caretaker. This is consistent with her personality. That's exactly the problem, Aunt Linda said firmly. Just because someone is naturally responsible and caring doesn't mean they should be expected to sacrifice their entire future for other people's comfort. That's not love, Patricia. That's exploitation. The word exploitation landed like a bomb in the middle of our Christmas morning celebration. Nobody had ever used such a harsh term to describe our family dynamic before. We'd always framed it in terms of love, responsibility, and temporary mutual support. But hearing it described as exploitation forced me to consider whether Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda might be seeing something that we'd all been too close to recognize. That's a terrible thing to say, Mom said, her voice shaking with emotion. We love Rachel. Everything we do is motivated by love for our family. I'm sure you do love her, Uncle Mark replied. But love shouldn't require one person to sacrifice everything while everyone else benefits without contributing. That's not sustainable, and it's not fair. Life isn't always fair, Tyler said suddenly. Sometimes people have to step up when circumstances require it. You're right, Uncle Mark agreed. Sometimes people do have to step up. But in this case, only one person has stepped up, and everyone else has stepped back. That's not how functional families handle crises. I looked around the table at my family members' faces, really seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Emma, 24 years old, and perfectly capable of working full-time, but choosing to pursue her art instead, while I funded her lifestyle. Tyler, 22 and physically capable of working, but preferring to explore his interests while I covered his expenses. Dad, 58 and experienced, but too proud to accept available employment while I supported him. Mom, 55 and healthy, but preferring to manage the household rather than earn income while I carried the financial burden. They weren't evil or deliberately manipulative, but they had all gradually arranged their lives around my willingness to work constantly to support them. They'd become comfortable with a dynamic that allowed them to pursue their preferences and dreams while I postponed mine indefinitely. "You know what bothers me most?" I said suddenly, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "It's not just the money. It's that nobody even acknowledges what I'm doing." "We acknowledge it," Mom said quickly. "We appreciate everything you do." "No, you don't," I replied, feeling 3 years of suppressed frustration finally beginning to surface. "You call it helping out or contributing as if I'm one of several people sharing the load equally. You take credit for things I've paid for and organized. You make plans that require my money without even asking if I can afford them." "That's not fair," Emma protested. "We don't take credit for your work." "This entire Christmas morning," I said, gesturing at the elaborate breakfast spread and expensive decorations surrounding us, "cost me almost $3,000. But when Uncle Mark complimented the beautiful celebration, Mom accepted the praise as if she'd created it. When people ask how we're managing financially, you all act like it's some mysterious family effort, rather than acknowledging that I'm supporting everyone." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in our conversation. This one felt heavier, loaded with recognition and uncomfortable truths that couldn't be disputed or explained away. "We didn't realize," Dad said quietly, "that you felt unappreciated." "It's not about feeling appreciated," I replied. "It's about being honest about what's actually happening here. I'm not contributing to a family effort. I am the family effort. And instead of working together to change that, everyone has just gotten comfortable with it." "So, what are you saying?" Mom asked, her voice tight with anxiety about where this conversation might be heading. For the first time in 3 years, I found myself considering that question seriously. What was I saying? What did I want to happen as a result of this conversation? Did I want everyone to suddenly get jobs and start contributing equally? Did I want acknowledgement and gratitude? Did I want to establish new boundaries and expectations? As I sat there surrounded by the expensive Christmas celebration I'd funded and the family I'd been supporting, I realized that what I wanted most was something I'd never allowed myself to want before. I wanted my own life back. "I'm saying," I began slowly, "that this arrangement isn't working for me anymore. I'm 26 years old, and I've spent the last 3 years living like I'm responsible for 4 dependents instead of building my own future. I love you all, but I can't keep doing this." The words felt both terrifying and liberating as they left my mouth. I was finally acknowledging out loud what I'd been thinking privately for months, but had been too afraid or too loyal to express. "You can't keep doing what?" Mom asked, though I could see in her expression that she understood exactly what I meant. "I can't keep funding everyone else's life while putting my own on hold indefinitely," I said with growing confidence. "I need to start living for myself, not just working to support everyone else." Mom's face had gone completely white now, and I could see panic beginning to replace anger in her expression. Because if I stopped covering the majority of our household expenses, our entire way of life would collapse within a matter of weeks. "Rachel," she said carefully, "you're understandably feeling overwhelmed. But let's not make any dramatic decisions on Christmas morning. We can discuss this later, as a family, and figure out a better arrangement." But I could hear in her tone that by better arrangement, she meant finding ways to make me feel more appreciated while continuing to carry the financial burden. Not actually changing the fundamental dynamic that had me supporting 4 adults who were capable of supporting themselves. "Mom," I said quietly, "how much later? It's been 3 years. How much longer should I wait for everyone else to become financially responsible adults?" The question hung in the air without an answer, because we all knew that without external pressure forcing change, The current arrangement could continue indefinitely. It was comfortable for everyone except me, and comfortable situations don't motivate people to make difficult changes. But Uncle Mark's questions had created external pressure. His direct acknowledgement of what I'd been unable to say myself had given me permission to finally speak truthfully about a situation I'd been tolerating out of misplaced loyalty and fear. And for the first time in 3 years, I was beginning to imagine what my life might look like if I stopped enabling everyone else's financial dependence and started prioritizing my own future instead. The thought was both exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. The silence stretching across our dining room felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda exchanged a meaningful look, and I could see them processing everything. They'd just learned about our family's financial dynamics. The twins, Sophia and Grace, seemed uncomfortable with the tension, but fascinated by the adult drama unfolding in front of them. Mom was gripping her coffee cup so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. She kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then closing it again, clearly struggling to find words that would restore the comfortable illusions we'd all been maintaining for 3 years. Finally, she found her voice. "I think this conversation has gotten completely out of hand," she said, forcing a bright smile that looked more like a grimace. "This is Christmas morning. We have guests. Can't we table this discussion for later and just enjoy our time together as a family?" But Uncle Mark wasn't ready to let the moment pass. "Patricia, I understand this is uncomfortable, but Rachel just told you that she can't continue supporting 4 adults indefinitely. That seems like something that needs to be addressed directly." "It's not that simple," Mom replied, her forced cheerfulness beginning to crack. "Rachel is being emotional. She's not thinking clearly about the consequences of what she's suggesting." "What consequences?" I asked, genuinely curious about her response. Mom looked at me with an expression of disbelief, as if I'd asked an obviously ridiculous question. "Rachel, if you suddenly stop contributing to household expenses, we could lose the house. Your father could lose his health insurance. We'd have to completely uproot our lives. So you'd have to face the same consequences that every other family faces when the primary earner loses their job," Uncle Mark observed. "You'd have to make adjustments, find new sources of income, maybe downsize your lifestyle. That's what most people do in these situations." "We're not most people," Mom said defensively. "We're a family that takes care of each other." "No," I said, my voice stronger now. "We're a family where one person takes care of everyone else while the others avoid taking care of themselves." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they felt true in a way that was both liberating and frightening. I'd never spoken to my family so directly before, never challenged the narrative that our financial arrangement was somehow noble or temporary. Emma's face flushed red. "That's not fair, Rachel. We don't avoid taking care of ourselves. We're just going through difficult transitions right now." "For 3 years?" I asked. "Emma, you're 24. How long is your transition period going to last? When do you plan to become financially independent?" "I'm working on building my art career," she said defensively. "That takes time. You can't just rush creative development." "I'm not asking you to rush anything," I replied. "I'm asking you to support yourself while you develop your art, like every other artist in the world does." "That's easy for you to say," Tyler interjected. "You have a stable career path. Some of us are still figuring things out." "Tyler, you're 22 years old," Uncle Mark said. "Most people your age work while they figure things out." The tension in the dining room had reached a breaking point. Tyler's defensive response about figuring things out, while being financially supported by his sister, had clearly struck a nerve with Uncle Mark, whose patience was wearing thin with the elaborate justifications my family kept offering for their prolonged financial dependence. "Tyler," Uncle Mark said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 2 successful daughters. "Most 22-year-olds work full-time jobs while they figure out their career direction. They don't have their siblings fund their exploration period for years at a time. It's not that simple, Tyler replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The job market is terrible for people our age. Everything requires experience, but nobody will give you experience without already having experience. That's exactly the kind of circular thinking that keeps people unemployed indefinitely, Aunt Linda said gently. There are entry-level positions available. You start somewhere, gain experience, and build from there. That's how careers develop. But what about following your passion? Emma asked. Everyone always says to follow your dreams and do what you love. That's what I'm doing with my art. Following your passion is a luxury that requires financial stability, Uncle Mark replied. When someone else is paying your bills, you have the privilege of pursuing your dreams without consequences. But that's not sustainable or fair to the person supporting you. Mom had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, and now she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Enough, she said, her voice sharp and commanding. I will not sit here on Christmas morning and listen to my family be lectured about our personal choices by people who don't understand our situation. Patricia, Uncle Mark said calmly, we're not lecturing anyone. We're pointing out that Rachel is supporting 4 capable adults who could be supporting themselves. That's not sustainable. And what exactly do you suggest we do? Mom demanded. Should David take some minimum wage job that barely covers gas money? Should Emma abandon her artistic development to work retail? Should Tyler settle for any random position instead of finding something that utilizes his potential? Yes, I said quietly, but my voice carried clearly across the room. That's exactly what I suggest. The word yes seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Everyone turned to look at me, and I could see shock and disbelief written across their faces. They'd expected me to defend them, to argue that their dreams and preferences were more important than financial reality. Rachel, Mom said, her voice filled with hurt and disappointment. I can't believe you'd say something so cruel. It's not cruel, I replied, standing up to face her directly. It's honest. Dad, you could have been working at Home Depot or Walmart for the past 2 years while looking for something better. That would have been $800 to $1,000 a month in household income instead of $0. Dad's face reddened, but he didn't respond. Emma, you could work full-time at literally anywhere and pursue art in your free time, like millions of other artists do. That would be another $1,200 to $1,500 monthly. Emma's mouth opened and closed without sound. Tyler, you could have been working any job for the past year instead of exploring your options. That's another $1,000 to $1,500. Tyler looked down at his hands. Combined, that would be $3,000 to $4,000 in monthly household income instead of everything falling on me. We could have been financially stable without me working myself into exhaustion. The numbers hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be denied or explained away, because the math was simple and undeniable. My family had chosen comfort and dreams over responsibility, leaving me to carry the consequences of their choices. But we don't want those kinds of jobs, Emma said weakly. I don't want to work 70 hours a week funding everyone else's lifestyle either, I replied. But I've been doing it anyway because I thought it was temporary. Because I thought you all were working toward independence. We are working toward independence, Mom insisted. No, you're not, Uncle Mark interjected. You're working toward maintaining dependence on Rachel while feeling better about it. That's not the same thing. Mom whirled around to face him, her composure finally cracking completely. How dare you come into my home on Christmas and attack my family like this? You have no right to judge how we handle our private affairs. Patricia, Aunt Linda said softly, we're not attacking anyone. We're concerned about Rachel. She's sacrificing her entire future for people who could be taking care of themselves. She chooses to help us, Mom said, but her voice was shaking now. Nobody forces her to do anything. Does she really have a choice? Uncle Mark asked. When the alternative is watching her family lose their home and health insurance? That's not a choice, Patricia. That's emotional manipulation, whether you intend it that way or not. The accusation of emotional manipulation hit Mom like a slap. Her face went white, then red, and for a moment I thought she might start screaming. Instead, she turned to me with an expression of pure fury. "Fine," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "If that's how you really feel about helping your family, if we're such a burden to you, then maybe you should just leave. Maybe this family would be better off without someone who keeps track of every dollar and throws our gratitude back in our faces." The words hit me like a physical blow, but not in the way she intended. Instead of feeling hurt or guilty, I felt something click into place inside my chest. A sense of clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. "You know what, Mom?" I said, my voice steady and calm. "You're absolutely right." The room went completely silent. Mom's angry expression faltered as she realized what I'd just said. "I should leave," I continued. "I should stop tracking every dollar I spend on this family. I should stop throwing my gratitude back in your faces. Most importantly, I should stop enabling 4 adults to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives." "Rachel," Dad said urgently, "don't be hasty. Your mother didn't mean—" "Yes, she did," I interrupted. And she was right. This family would probably be better off without me hovering over the finances and making everyone feel guilty about their choices. You'd finally have to face the real consequences of those choices instead of having me cushion every impact. Mom's face had gone pale again. "I didn't mean you should actually leave. I just meant—" "You meant that I should be grateful for the privilege of supporting 4 adults while keeping my mouth shut about the unfairness of it," I said. "But I'm not grateful anymore, Mom, and I'm done keeping quiet." I looked around the table at each family member, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Emma, talented and creative but unwilling to support herself. Tyler, intelligent and capable but preferring to be supported while he found himself. Dad, experienced and skilled but too proud to take available work. Mom, healthy and capable but choosing to manage a household instead of earning income. They weren't evil people. They weren't intentionally cruel or manipulative. But they had all gradually arranged their lives around my willingness to work constantly to support them, and they'd become comfortable with that arrangement. They'd stopped seeing it as temporary assistance and started treating it as a permanent entitlement. "I'm moving out," I announced, surprising myself with how natural the words felt. "I'm getting my own apartment, and I'm stopping all financial contributions to this household." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, and what sounded like someone's rapid breathing. "You can't be serious," Mom whispered. "I'm completely serious," I replied. "I should have done this 2 years ago." "Rachel," Emma said, her voice pleading, "you can't just abandon us. We're your family." "I'm not abandoning anyone," I said firmly. "I'm refusing to continue enabling you. There's a difference." "When?" Dad asked quietly. "Soon," I said. "Within the next few weeks. But the mortgage payment is due January 3rd, Tyler said, and I could hear panic creeping into his voice. "Then you'll need to figure out how to handle that," I replied. "All of you. Together. We can't possibly come up with $1,800 by January 3rd, Mom said desperately. "Then you'll need to call the mortgage company and work out a payment plan," I said. "Or Dad will need to find immediate employment, or Emma will need to get a full-time job, or Tyler will need to start working, or some combination of all of those things." "That's impossible," Emma protested. "No, it's not," Uncle Mark interjected. "It's exactly what every other family in financial crisis has to do. You figure it out because you don't have another choice." "But we do have another choice," Mom said, turning back to me with desperate eyes. "Rachel, You're being emotional and impulsive. Take some time to think about this. We can work out a better arrangement, something that feels more fair to everyone." "What kind of arrangement?" I asked. "Well," she said, clearly scrambling for solutions, "maybe everyone could contribute a little bit more, and you could contribute a little bit less. We could create a more balanced system." "How much would everyone else contribute?" I pressed. Mom looked around the table at Dad, Emma, and Tyler, clearly hoping one of them would offer specific numbers. When no one spoke up, she said, "We'd have to work out the details, but everyone would do their fair share." "Based on income?" I asked. "Well, yes, that would make sense." "Dad, what's your current monthly income?" Dad shifted uncomfortably. "I'm still between positions." "So $0. Emma, what's your monthly income from the coffee shop?" "About $400, she said reluctantly. "Tyler, your monthly income?" "I'm not working right now," he admitted. So Mom would contribute 0, Dad would contribute 0, Tyler would contribute 0, and Emma could maybe contribute $200 toward household expenses, I summarized. That would leave me covering $2,800 of our $3,000 monthly budget. How is that more balanced? The math was undeniable. Even if everyone suddenly became motivated to contribute more, the numbers wouldn't work unless people actually got jobs and started earning real income. "We'd get jobs," Emma said weakly. "When?" I asked. "Soon," Tyler added. "How soon? Next? Week? Next month? Next year?" Neither of them answered. "You see," I said, looking around the table, "this is exactly the problem. Everything is always soon or eventually, or when the right opportunity comes along. But meanwhile, I'm supposed to keep working constantly to support everyone, while you all take your time figuring out your perfect career paths. Life isn't just about money," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're right," I agreed. "Life isn't just about money. It's also about fairness and responsibility and building a future. And for the past 3 years, I haven't been able to do any of those things because I've been too busy funding everyone else's ability to avoid adult responsibilities." Uncle Mark cleared his throat. "Rachel, do you have a plan for moving out? Have you found an apartment?" "Not yet," I admitted. "But I've been saving money when I could. I have enough for a deposit and first month's rent." "What about furniture and household items?" Aunt Linda asked practically. "I'll figure it out. As I go," I said. "It doesn't have to be perfect immediately." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Rachel, please don't do this. We need you. I need you." For a moment, seeing her cry made me waver. The old familiar guilt started rising in my chest, the feeling that I was responsible for everyone's emotional well-being as well as their financial security. But then I remembered Uncle Mark's question about what steps they were taking toward independence and their inability to provide any concrete answers. I remembered 3 years of working myself into exhaustion while everyone else pursued their preferences. I remembered the constant pressure of being the only person in a household of 5 who was concerned about paying bills. "Mom," I said gently, "you don't need me. You need my money. There's a difference." "That's not true," she protested. "We love you. You're an important part of this family." "I know you love me," I replied. "But love shouldn't require one person to sacrifice everything for everyone else's comfort. That's not love, that's dependency." "So you're just going to walk away from your family?" Tyler asked, his voice bitter. "I'm not walking away from you," I said. "I'm walking away from being your financial support system. You'll still be my family, but I won't be your bank account anymore." The distinction felt important. I wasn't cutting off all contact or relationships. I was changing the fundamental dynamic that had made me responsible for everyone else's financial welfare. "This is ridiculous," Emma said, standing up from the table. "You're being selfish and dramatic over money." "Emma," Uncle Mark said firmly, Expecting 4 adults to support themselves isn't selfish. Expecting one person to support 4 adults indefinitely is selfish. This is our business, Emma shot back. You have no right to interfere in our family dynamics. You made it our business when you admitted that Rachel has been supporting all of you for 3 years, Aunt Linda replied. That's not a family dynamic. That's financial abuse. The words financial abuse landed like another bomb in the room. Emma's face went red, and Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Now you've gone too far, Mom said angrily. We are not abusing Rachel. We love her and appreciate everything she does. Appreciation without change is just empty words, Uncle Mark said. If you really appreciated Rachel's sacrifice, you would have worked to end your dependence on her instead of settling into it as a permanent arrangement. We didn't settle into anything, Dad protested. The situation just evolved this way, because of circumstances. Circumstances that you could have changed at any point over the past 3 years, Uncle Mark replied. But you chose not to because it was easier to let Rachel handle everything. I listened to this back and forth with a strange sense of detachment. For years, I'd been too close to the situation to see it clearly. But hearing Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda describe our family dynamics from an outside perspective, I could finally see how unhealthy and unsustainable everything had become. I'm going to start looking for apartments tomorrow, I announced, cutting through the argument. Rachel, please, Mom said desperately. At least wait until after New Year's. Give us time to adjust to this idea and make some plans. I've been waiting for 3 years for you to make plans, I replied. How much more time do you need? Just a few weeks, she pleaded. We can't possibly figure everything out immediately. I looked around the table at faces that were finally showing genuine concern about our financial situation. For 3 years, that concern had been entirely my burden to carry. Now that I was removing myself from the equation, everyone was suddenly aware of how precarious our situation actually was. Okay, I said finally. I'll stay through the end of January. That gives you 4 weeks to figure out new living arrangements. Find jobs, apply for assistance programs, or whatever else you need to do. But on February 1st, I'm moving out and stopping all financial contributions. The compromise felt generous to me, but I could see relief on everyone's faces that I wasn't leaving immediately. 4 weeks isn't very long, Tyler said. It's longer than most people get when they lose their primary source of income, Uncle Mark pointed out. Most families have to adjust immediately when someone loses a job. And it's more time than I got to adjust when Dad lost his job, I added. I started covering bills the next month without any transition period. The parallel seemed to hit Dad hard. He'd been expecting immediate support when his income disappeared, but he was asking for weeks of preparation time to replace that support with alternative sources. We'll make it work, Dad said quietly. I'll start applying for positions. Tomorrow, any positions. I can pick up more shifts at the coffee shop, Emma offered, and maybe look for additional part-time work. I'll start job hunting seriously, Tyler added. No more being picky about opportunities. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. This was the kind of practical planning that should have happened 3 years ago, but at least it was happening now. What about the house? Mom asked. Even if everyone starts working immediately, we might not be able to afford the mortgage long term. Then you'll need to consider downsizing, Uncle Mark said gently. There's no shame in moving to something more affordable while you rebuild your financial stability. The idea of losing the house clearly pained Mom, but she nodded reluctantly. I suppose we could look into smaller apartments or rental houses. Or Dad could move in with one of his siblings temporarily while everyone gets established, I suggested. There are lots of options if you're willing to make adjustments. For the first time in years, we were talking about practical solutions, instead of just hoping everything would somehow work out magically. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a strange, subdued atmosphere. Uncle Mark and Aunt Linda stayed for dinner. but conversation was stilted and awkward. The twins seemed confused by the tension and relieved when their parents finally announced it was time to head back to Columbus. As they were leaving, Uncle Mark pulled me aside. "You're doing the right thing," he said quietly. "It's going to be difficult, but you can't sacrifice your entire life for people who aren't willing to take responsibility for themselves." "I hope so," I replied. "I feel guilty but also relieved. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," he said. "You've been carrying a burden that should have been shared by everyone. It's natural to feel guilty about setting it down, but also natural to feel relieved." After they left, my immediate family sat in the living room without much conversation. The beautiful Christmas decorations I'd funded seemed to mock the financial crisis we were all finally acknowledging. "So what happens now?" Emma asked. "Eventually. Now you all figure out how to support yourselves," I said simply. "Just like every other adult in the world." "Are you really not going to help at all?" Tyler asked. "I'm helping by forcing you to become independent," I replied. "The best thing I can do for this family is stop enabling everyone to avoid growing up." Mom was quiet for a long time, staring at the Christmas tree with tears running down her cheeks. "I never meant for it to go on this long," she said finally. "When your father lost his job, I really thought it would be temporary." "I know," I said, "but intentions don't change the reality of what happened." "We took advantage of you," Dad said quietly. "We didn't mean to, but we did." The admission was both painful and liberating to hear. After years of pretending that our arrangement was somehow fair and temporary, someone was finally acknowledging the truth about what had actually happened. "Thank you for saying that," I said. Over the next 4 weeks, my family made more progress toward financial independence than they had in the previous 3 years combined. Dad found a job at a hardware store within a week of starting his serious job search. Emma increased her hours at the coffee shop and picked up weekend shifts at a retail store. Tyler got hired at a grocery store and started working 40 hours a week for the first time in his adult life. Mom initially resisted the idea of working outside the home, but when the math became clear that 3 part-time jobs wouldn't cover our household expenses, she reluctantly applied for positions and found work as a receptionist at a dental office. By the end of January, they had collectively cobbled together about $2,500 in monthly income. It wasn't enough to maintain our current lifestyle, but it was enough to afford a smaller apartment and basic living expenses. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in Fairfield, about 30 minutes from downtown. It was small and needed some updating, but it was mine. The rent was $800 monthly, which felt incredibly reasonable after years of covering a mortgage 3 times that amount. Moving day was emotionally complicated. My family was sad to see me go, but also clearly anxious about managing without my financial safety net. I was excited about finally having my own space, but also worried about whether they'd be able to maintain their new jobs and financial responsibilities. "You know you can come back if this doesn't work out," Mom said as I loaded the last box into my car. "Mom," I said gently, "this is going to work out. You'll figure it out because you don't have another choice. But what if we can't make enough money? What if someone loses their job?" "Then you'll do what every other family does," I replied. "You'll find ways to earn more money, or you'll reduce your expenses, or you'll ask for help from social services. You'll figure it out." The confidence in my voice surprised me. For 3 years, I'd been terrified of what would happen to my family if I stopped supporting them. But now that they were actually facing that reality, they were proving capable of handling it. 6 months after I moved out, my family had settled into their new normal. They were renting a 3-bedroom townhouse that cost significantly less than our old mortgage. Everyone had maintained their jobs and even gotten small raises or additional hours. They'd learned to budget, cook more meals at home, and find free entertainment options. They were living like a normal middle-class family dealing with financial limitations, instead of living like wealthy people supported by someone else's sacrifices. I visited for dinner once a month, but the dynamic was completely different. Instead of showing up to a house I'd funded and meals I'd paid for, I was a guest bringing wine or dessert to contribute to gatherings my family had planned and funded themselves. They never asked me for money, not once. They'd learned that I wouldn't provide it, and more importantly, they'd learned that they didn't actually need me to survive. They just needed to take responsibility for their own lives. As for me, I was finally building the life I'd postponed for 3 years. I'd paid off my credit cards, rebuilt my emergency fund, and started saving for long-term goals like travel, and maybe eventually buying my own home. I'd gotten a promotion at work that came with both higher pay and better work-life balance, since I no longer needed to take every freelance project available. I started dating someone I met through a hiking group, traveled to Europe for the first time, and took a pottery class just because it sounded fun. Simple pleasures that had been impossible when every spare dollar and minute was dedicated to supporting 4 other adults. The most surprising change was in my relationship with my family. Without the constant underlying tension about money and responsibility, we actually enjoyed each other's company more. Conversations weren't dominated by financial stress or guilt about who was contributing what. We could just be family members who cared about each other without complicated dynamics, about dependency and obligation. Looking back, I realized that Uncle Mark's confrontation on Christmas morning had been the catalyst I needed to finally acknowledge what I'd been unable to say myself. I wasn't helping my family by supporting them indefinitely. I was enabling them to avoid growing up and taking responsibility for their own lives. The kindest thing I could do for them was exactly what Mom had suggested in her moment of anger: disappear from their financial picture so they could learn to handle their own lives. It forced them to develop skills and resilience they'd never needed while I was covering all the consequences of their choices. And the kindest thing I could do for myself was stop sacrificing my entire future for people who were perfectly capable of building their own futures if they were required to do so. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's helplessness, even when that someone is your family, especially when that someone is your family. I never returned to being their financial safety net, and they never needed me to. They just needed to discover that they could take care of themselves when they didn't have another option. That Christmas morning, when Mom told me to disappear, she gave me the best gift I'd ever received: permission to finally put myself first. I took her advice, and it saved both my life and theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.